Hello, welcome to video number 11 in our Canadian Federation unit. This is our last video, and today's essential question is, what were the goals of McDonald's national policy, and also, was the policy a success? In order to answer that question, you'll have to be able to identify the answers to our success criteria, which are, I can name the objectives of the national policy, to name the three components of the national policy. So our final success criteria is indicate the main industrial sectors that were developed during the second phase of industrialization. I hope you enjoy today's video, and let's get started. So today's first essential question asks us, what were the goals of national policy? So in order to answer that question, I think it's first very important that we first know what national policy is. So I wanted to ask, what is national policy? And basically national policy was an economic program that's introduced by this man right here, that's Sir John A. Macdonald. So national policy, by definition, is an economic program that was introduced by the Macdonald Conservative Party government in 1876. Although it was introduced at that time, it wasn't actually put into action, meaning it didn't get passed until 1879. Okay, so it was an economic program. Okay, so now that we know what national policy is, we can now move on to asking our central question, what were its goals? And so the goals can really be broke down to three. Okay, the first goal of national policy was to protect Canadian industries. The second was to further settle Western Canada, which, if you remember, it had just expanded to in last video. And finally, it was to develop the domestic market. At this point, you probably should be asking yourself the question, well, what does domestic mean? And by domestic, I really simply just mean like the internal market. So the market of Canada. So we're not looking like outside or, outside of Canada. We're looking internally. So those were the goals. Okay, so to continue answering our essential question, we're going to look at success criteria right now. So we had just talked about the goals of national policy. Now let's look at some of the components of it, so how they executed their plan. So number one, they wanted to increase tariffs to protect Canada's industries. Basically what this means is that they decided that they were going to charge people a tariff, or basically a duty or a tax, to import goods from other parts of the world. This was designed to encourage people to not import goods from other countries, but rather to keep products or to create business just internally in the market, right? So to trade amongst one another internally. So higher tariffs or higher duties were designed to promote or protect Canada's industry. The second component was to extend the railway that was being built, so that railway network from one end of the country all the way to the other end of the country. So from west all the way to the east. Really think of it from Vancouver to Halifax. So they started building what was called the Canadian Pacific Railway, and it went from Pacific Ocean to Atlantic Ocean, and really the hope was to open Canada's colonization and its trade. So the project presented people with an opportunity to really connect the provinces, which they would hope would increase trade between the different regions of the country to further develop their own internal economy. Something to keep in mind, though, is that Macdonald's administration was really committed to the building of this railway, and it ended up costing them quite a bit of money. And so what we'll get to in just one moment is how much money that cost. And finally, the last component is the increase, or rather to increase population by encouraging European immigration. We call this basically population through immigration. So the Macdonald government hoped to make a profit on their investment that they had put into the Canadian Pacific Railway, and they wanted to develop the domestic market. In order to do that, they knew that they had to increase their population, and so they turned to Europe for that. They started really recruiting Europeans to come over to Canada. Number one, obviously, was to build their population, but two was their economy. And they knew that they had spent a ton of money on the railroad, so they wanted to invest in very cheap labor to help construct the railroad. So they invested in Europeans. They promised immigrant workers that if they came over, that eventually they were promised that future immigrants would be given a ton of land that was suitable for farming in exchange for their work. So something to take away from that was that they knew that the population needed to continue to grow. They knew that the natural birth rate wasn't growing at a large enough rate, so they started to try to build their population with Europeans. So despite their efforts, it's really important to note that the immigration rate remained quite low under the Macdonald government, and it took a really long time before they started to see the beneficial effects, which we'll get to in a moment. But just to summarize real quick, so the increase of tariffs basically means, okay, hiking up tax to import a good so that people stayed local for their products, okay? So stimulate, like really this just means stimulate the internal economy. Second, extend the railroad, connect the provinces. Okay, connect the provinces, but also create a stronger economy. That's a stronger economy. And finally, increase population. They were trying to build the railroad cheaper by using immigrants. Okay, so on to our second essential question now. Was national policy a success? Well, yes, it was, because it further developed the economy. It connected regions by railroads, and it also allowed the population to start to grow slowly as a result of immigration. However, it's important to really note that it took quite a bit of time to actually see the effects of national policy. In fact, it took so long that Macdonald's Conservative government lost its popularity and was actually defeated by Wilfrid Laurier's Liberals in the 1896 election. So Laurier became the next prime minister, due in large part to people not being happy with national policy. So Wilfrid Laurier was elected as the Prime Minister of Canada in 1896, and he actually kept some principles of national policy that were put in place by Macdonald. However, it was actually during Laurier's tenure as the Prime Minister that the economy really began to benefit from the effects of the policy, and the country really started to finally experience a period of prosperity in terms of immigration, in terms of industrial development, as well as just overall, development internally. And just before we go, we'll just also mention that one of the other sort of effects of national policy was that people living in Western Canada sort of grew not envious, but rather frustrated because all of the manufacturing sector existed in Eastern Canada. They were the places that were actually manufacturing goods. And so people were working very hard in the West on, in terms of farming and agriculture, wheat, farms and whatnot, and most of the stuff that was actually being exported out was from Eastern Canada, and so it seemed almost like the West was working hard and the East was benefiting from it, so that created tension. And also the railroads that they had built over a 5-year period were extremely expensive, creating debt. Okay, finally, the last thing we'll discuss today is just another one of our success criteria, which was to indicate the industrial sectors that would actually develop during the second phase of industrialization. So we talked about the first phase of industrialization a couple of videos ago, discussing how an internal market was starting to be created after protectionism was abandoned, and how basically Canada needed to learn how to make things on its own to have a manufacturing sector, and once it was able to do that, technology improved. Well, now there's a second phase of industrialization where new sectors actually opened up. So in the early 20th century, some of the new sectors that emerged were highly dependent on the exploitation of the territory's natural resources. So in Quebec in the 1900s, things like aluminum, hydroelectricity, pulp and paper, mining, something called electrochemistry, accounted for about 9% of the industrial production. This number actually rose to 22% by 1929, and then Ontario, Quebec, and BC benefited the most from this new industrial expansion because they had the most amount of natural resources available to them. If you take just a quick look at this image, one of the things that came about at that time was something that we know very well in Quebec. It's called hydroelectric power. It's basically a tool that combined with tools now allowed you to take the energy that could be produced from water and you could turn it into electrical power. This was really great because it led to this, which is a pulp and paper mill in Grand-Mère near Mauricie in about 1908. And this was a pulp and paper mill. So with hydroelectric power and new mechanical tools, it was now possible in Canada to turn actual wood, like timber, into pulp, and pulp could be then made into paper. So Canada became a major paper producer at that time, and the pulp and paper industry moved into regions with abundant supplies of timber, such as the Saguenay, Mauricie, and the Outaouais, which is where we are from, in our regions. A lot of pulp and paper. And so this was really big during the second phase of industrialization, specifically for Canada. The very last thing I'm just going to talk to you about today very quickly, which is important, were the working conditions during the second phase of industrialization. The working conditions. Please excuse my writing. That's working conditions. And basically what I just want you to take away from that is that the working conditions were very, very awful because thousands of immigrants were coming into Canada in the early 20th century, and they really couldn't just take that on easily when you have that many more people coming in. Basically, they couldn't accommodate so many residents, and so in overpopulated working class neighborhoods, families were absolutely crowded and cramped into unsanitary lodgings, and the absence of fresh water and sewers caused hygiene and health problems everywhere. A lot of diseases spread rapidly. Meanwhile, in factories like the pulp and paper mill, working conditions were often very appalling, okay? It was not uncommon to work for over 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Injured workers were automatically fired without compensation and replaced by others. So these deteriorating working conditions pushed the federal government to set up a Royal Commission of Inquiry, but the thing to take away is that working conditions were very, very bad.